Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a moment to reflect on the nature of what we are dealing with. Racism, this peculiar, insidious construct, operates not only as a means of categorizing people, but as a fundamental distortion of individual perception. It's a failure, a deeply embedded error in cognition, wherein the complexity of a person is flattened into a mere attribute, an abstraction that removes the richness of their identity and replaces it with a caricature. And that's dangerous not just morally, but practically, psychologically, and socially. It leads to resentment, alienation, destruction, and ultimately suffering of a kind that spreads far beyond what anyone might initially predict. What we must understand is that people are not groups. They are not merely representatives of some historical force, nor are they reducible to skin color, ethnicity, or ancestry. To engage with others in such a way is to deny the fundamental reality of their individuality. And why would anyone want to do that? Because it's easy. It's much easier to categorize than to understand. Much simpler to label than to listen. Much more comfortable to remain ensconced in the security of prejudice than to undertake the difficult, exhausting process of true engagement. But what is the cost of such simplicity? What happens when we abandon the responsibility to regard one another as unique, autonomous individuals? History tells us, and it tells us in brutal detail. It's not just oppression and cruelty, it's genocide, war, social decay, and the erosion of trust between people who might otherwise work together to build something meaningful. When the individual is sacrificed to the collective, when the particular is swallowed by the general, then violence is never far behind. And there's no virtue in that, none whatsoever. There is a better way, and it's not as complicated as it might seem. The antidote to racism isn't some utopian vision where everyone magically transcends their biases overnight. No, it's much simpler and more profound than that. It's the courage to treat each person you meet as an individual, not as a member of some arbitrary category. It's the discipline to refuse the easy path of scapegoating and resentment. It's the humility to recognize that you don't know another person's experience simply by looking at them. And yes, this is a burden. It's a responsibility because it means you must listen, you must think, you must challenge yourself in your assumptions, and that is difficult. But it is worth it because anything less than that leads down a path that humanity has already walked, and it is a path paved with suffering, with destruction, and with regret. So, enough with the cowardice of categorization. Enough with the intellectual laziness of collective guilt or inherited virtue. Enough with the failure to see one another as the infinitely complex beings we are. The alternative is clear, and the choice, though difficult, is ultimately the only one that leads toward truth, toward order, and toward peace. Racism is not merely a social problem, nor is it merely a political issue. It is, at its inaugural, a cognitive and moral failure. It is a failure of perception, a failure of thought, and a failure of responsibility. It is an oversimplification of reality, one that reduces individuals to categories, abstracts away their complexity, and imposes a framework of understanding that is fundamentally flawed. And this is no small mistake. This is a deep pathological error, one that has consequences that stretch far beyond the immediate and the obvious. Consider for a moment the nature of identity itself. Every person is an individual, a deeply unique, infinitely complex being with a history, a personality, a set of experiences, and a capacity for choice. To see another human being is to encounter a mystery, something far greater than what can be captured by surface-level attributes such as race. And yet, racism operates on the premise that a person is first and foremost a representative of a group, a mere extension of a historical narrative, rather than a sovereign individual. This is a fundamental misapprehension of reality. It is an intellectual shortcut, an attempt to categorize rather than to understand, to judge rather than to engage. And this misapprehension does not come without cost. The moment you cease to see people as individuals, you cease to treat them as such. You deny them their agency, you strip them of their humanity, you create a world in which guilt and virtue are assigned at birth, where the sins of history are passed from generation to generation like an inescapable curse. This is not justice. This is not wisdom. This is cruelty masquerading as understanding. Morally, racism is indefensible. It breeds resentment, hostility, and division. It undermines the principles of fairness and personal accountability, replacing them with narratives of inherited blame or unearned righteousness. Worse still, it justifies oppression in the name of justice, allowing people to commit acts of exclusion and violence while convincing themselves they are acting righteously. And history has shown us where that leads time and time again. The proper alternative is not collectivist guilt or tribal loyalty. The proper alternative is individual responsibility. It is the discipline to engage with others as they are, rather than as we assume them to be. It is the courage to resist the easy, destructive path of prejudice and to embrace the difficult, noble task of true understanding. That is the only path forward. The idea that individuals are not groups is not just a moral assertion, it is a fundamental truth about human nature. And yet, people repeatedly fall into the trap of seeing others not as individuals, but as mere representatives of a category, a race, a class, or a collective identity. This is an error in intellectual, psychological, and moral error, and it has devastating consequences when it becomes the foundation for how we interact with the world. At the heart of this issue is the distinction between the particular and the general. You are not simply the sum of your demographic characteristics. You are not merely white or black, male or female, rich or poor. You are a specific person with a history, a temperament, a set of experiences, and a unique capacity to make choices. The moment someone defines you by your group identity, they strip you of your individuality. They place you in a category, reducing the richness of your existence into something simple, something digestible, something that can be judged without effort or understanding. And that is a profound injustice. One of the most dangerous aspects of group identity is that it creates a false sense of moral clarity. It allows people to assume they know everything about you without ever having to speak to you. If you are part of the oppressor group, you are guilty before you even open your mouth. If you are part of the oppressed group, you are virtuous by default. But life is not that simple. No individual carries the sins of an entire race, nor does anyone inherit virtue simply by belonging to a particular category. People must be judged and must judge themselves on the basis of their own actions, their own choices, their own character. When we abandon individual identity in favor of group identity, we invite chaos. History has shown us where this path leads: tribalism, warfare, genocide, and oppression, all justified in the name of some grand, overarching narrative. But there is an alternative: the recognition of individual dignity, the understanding that every person is a world unto themselves, not a mere extension of a collective. To truly move forward, we must reject the ease of categorization and embrace the challenge of real human engagement. That means treating people as individuals, not as faceless members of a predetermined group. It means recognizing that responsibility, justice, and morality operate at the level of the person, not the collective. And it means refusing to allow history, ideology, or resentment to dictate how we see one another. History is not merely a collection of past events. It is a warning, a guide, a brutal and unforgiving teacher that shows us time and time again the cost of our failures. And one of the most catastrophic failures humanity has repeatedly indulged in is the belief that people should be judged, categorized, and treated according to their group identity rather than their individual character. This is not a trivial mistake. This is the error that has fueled some of the worst atrocities the world has ever seen. Consider the horrors of the 20th century. The Nazi regime did not see individuals, it saw races, and it acted accordingly, leading to one of the most systematic and horrifying genocides in human history. The Soviet Union and Maoist China categorized people based on class identity rather than race, but the outcome was just as disastrous: tens of millions slaughtered in the name of collectivist ideology. And what was the justification? Always the same: the belief that some people, by virtue of their birth, were oppressors, and others, by virtue of theirs, were victims. That justice was not something to be determined based on individual actions, but rather on group membership. That the sins of the past could be repaid with the suffering of the present. And yet, despite all this historical evidence, people continue to make the same mistake. They continue to believe that the solution to injustice is more collectivism, more categorization, more tribalism. But that is not the lesson history teaches us. History teaches us that the moment you abandon individual responsibility in favor of group identity, you set the stage for cruelty on an unimaginable scale. It begins subtly. First, people are divided into categories: the privileged and the oppressed, the righteous and the wicked. Then those categories become moral judgments. Then laws and policies are created based on those judgments. And before long, the idea that people should be judged on their own merits is forgotten entirely. And that is when the real horrors begin. If we are to learn anything from history, it should be this: we must resist the temptation to see the world through the lens of race, class, or any other collective identity. The only way forward, the only way to avoid repeating the disasters of the past, is to recognize that every human being is an individual capable of good and evil, responsible for their own actions. Anything less leads only to destruction. The solution to racism or to any form of prejudice is not to impose top-down ideological systems that enforce collective guilt or inherited virtue. It is not to demand repentance for the sins of history from people who did not commit them, nor is it to bestow moral superiority upon individuals simply because they belong to a particular demographic. The real solution is something far more difficult, far more demanding, and far more necessary: personal responsibility. What does that mean? It means that every person must take it upon themselves to engage with others as individuals, rather than as members of some abstract group. It means refusing to allow resentment, anger, or ideological narratives to dictate how you treat people. It means being honest with yourself about your own biases and taking the necessary steps to challenge them, not because someone forces you to, but because it is the right thing to do. Personal responsibility is difficult because it requires effort. It is far easier to outsource moral judgment to a collective framework, to assume that history itself will dictate who is good and who is evil, who is deserving of opportunity and who is not. But that kind of thinking is lazy. It removes the burden of individual discernment and replaces it with blind allegiance to a narrative. And once you do that, once you allow group identity to supersede individual character, you open the door to all manner of injustices justified in the name of some supposed greater good. What is the alternative? The alternative is to hold yourself accountable for the way you perceive and treat others. It is to engage with people not as representatives of a race, gender, or class, but as complex, autonomous individuals. It is to insist that justice be applied at the level of the person, not the group. It is to recognize that while history may shape our circumstances, it does not dictate our moral worth, nor does it determine our capacity for growth, understanding, or redemption. If we truly wish to build a world free from racism, then we must abandon the path of blame and victimhood. We must reject the easy temptation to divide people into moral categories based on collective identity, and we must instead embrace the far harder, far more noble path of individual responsibility. Because in the end, the only thing that truly moves the world forward is the willingness of each person to stand up, take ownership of their perceptions and actions, and commit to treating others with the dignity they deserve. The tendency to categorize people, to see them not as individuals, but as mere representatives of a group, is an intellectual and moral abdication. It is a form of cowardice, a refusal to engage with reality in all its complexity. It is far easier to make sweeping generalizations, to assume that a person's character, values, and intentions are predetermined by their race, gender, or class. But that is not wisdom. That is not justice. That is the path of resentment, division, and ultimately destruction. Why do people fall into this trap? Because it is simple. It relieves them of the burden of thinking. If all members of a particular group are either oppressors or victims, good or evil, worthy or unworthy, then no further investigation is required. No uncomfortable conversations need to take place. No effort needs to be made to understand the individual standing in front of you. This kind of thinking is tempting precisely because it allows people to avoid responsibility, the responsibility of engaging with others as unique, complex human beings. But here is the problem. When you categorize people in this way, you do not see them for who they truly are. You see only a projection of your own biases, your own fears, your own ideological presuppositions. You are no longer dealing with reality, you are dealing with an abstraction, a caricature. And when society as a whole begins to function in this manner, it lays the groundwork for persecution, injustice, and cruelty on a massive scale. History has shown this repeatedly. When people are seen not as individuals but as members of a faceless collective, the worst atrocities become possible because it is much easier to oppress, discriminate against, or even destroy a category than it is to do the same to a person standing before you, looking you in the eye, possessing the same depth of being as yourself. The alternative, the correct and courageous path, is to reject this intellectual cowardice and insist on engaging with people as they are. That means taking the time to listen, to think, to judge others based on their actions rather than their ancestry. It means standing against the ideological movements that demand we see one another as enemies rather than as fellow human beings. And it means taking responsibility for our own perceptions, ensuring that we do not fall into the lazy, destructive trap of assuming we know everything about a person simply because of the category we have assigned to them. The moral demand placed upon each of us is clear. We must rise above the easy, bitter path of collective judgment and assume the far more difficult burden of personal responsibility. That means rejecting the resentment that fuels racism. It means refusing to see others as mere reflections of history, as faceless members of a tribe, as placeholders in some grand ideological battle. It means treating people as they truly are, complex, sovereign individuals capable of both good and evil, worthy of respect not because of their race, gender, or ancestry, but because they are human. And this is not just a polite social preference, it is a necessity, an existential necessity. The moment we surrender to the impulse to divide, to categorize, to assign blame and virtue based on birth rather than action, we walk the same path that has led to unimaginable suffering throughout history. We cannot afford to make that mistake again. Instead, we must choose the harder, nobler path, the path of honest engagement, the path of personal accountability, the path that demands we look at each other not as enemies or as abstractions, but as individuals flawed, striving, and ultimately deserving of dignity. That is the only foundation upon which a just and functional society can be built, and anything less leads only to chaos, destruction, and despair. So stand up, speak the truth, take responsibility, reject the cowardice of categorization, insist upon the value of the individual, yours and everyone else's, because the alternative is something we have seen before and we know where it leads, and we must not go there again.